Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to Chapter 1. I'm going to walk through parts of the PowerPoint with you. I do not read the PowerPoint word for word. I just want to cover kind of the most difficult concepts or the ones that students usually get hung up on. Remember, stick to your chapter learning objectives. That's going to help you prepare for the test. If you have any questions on a slide that I skip, or maybe I didn't cover something on a slide that you have a question about, feel free to send me an email or post it on the discussion board so other people can chime in. Here we have definitions for anatomy and physiology. Pretty basic, but what you need to realize is that they're all interrelated. And this doesn't really come into play until you get into 202 a little bit more. But think about it this way. If I wanted to tell you how the heart works, the physiology, the function behind the heart, I have to explain to you what the structure looks like. Right? You can't understand how the heart pumps blood if you don't understand what an atria is or what ventricles are or what valves are, right? So they want you to understand that you have to learn these things together. Some schools you learn the anatomy first and then you learn the physiology. We kind of do everything together. We're going to explain the anatomy to you and then we're going to explain to you how it functions. Scientific method. We all do this, we just don't think about the fact that we do it. So one of my examples that I use when I teach general biology is, let's say you go out in the morning and your car doesn't start. So you put your key in, you turn it over, and nothing happens. So your first thought would be, maybe it's the battery. That is a hypothesis. And then what are you doing? You're testing that hypothesis. You go and get another battery, you replace the battery, you go to start the car again, and the car doesn't start, let's say. What do you do with your initial hypothesis? You reject it, right? I replaced the battery. The battery's not an issue. Guess what? You start this whole process over again. Okay, what's the next thing that it could be? And we'll fix that and we'll see if that either proves, or I should say, accepts or rejects our hypothesis. So sometimes people will say, science is always changing their mind. Why should we believe, anything that they say? And again, this could be relevant to today, right? Scientific method is kind of this trial and error. It's the best guess that we have with the data that we have on hand. So if the data changes, your ideas have to change, right? So if you went out to your car and you replaced the battery and the car still wouldn't start, you wouldn't keep saying it's the battery, right? You'd reject that and you'd start over again. So that kind of is the process of science. Great information here on the slide and in the textbook, kind of gives you the best practices. You're going to have to study daily. I often hear people say, I've never had to study every day. I could just go to class, I could listen, or I could watch a video and listen, and I could ace the test. Anatomy and physiology is not like that. You have to really be able to understand what it is. It's not just this short-term memory. You have to put it in your long-term memory, and you have to be able to use it as a foundation to build upon. So you'll see kind of as we move through these chapters, when I tell you something in chapter 2 or 3, like chapter 2 is chemistry, it's going to come back up again when we do muscles down the road. So everything is building, no learn and purge, right? Here are the characteristics that describe living things, right? So they're organized. We're going to talk about cells in a little bit, right? So inside the cell, we're going to have DNA and we're going to have nucleus, right? And that's going to be inside a larger cell, and we're going to have all kinds of other complexes and structures out here. And we have this plasma membrane that separates the internal things from the external things, right? Metabolism, sum of all chemical reactions. Basically, if I'm going to build things or I'm going to break things down. Growth and development. I want to show you the next slide or maybe the one after that. You really should understand meiosis and meiosis, just the basic definition right now. So here we kind of have the division line. This is reproduction. We're not going to cover this in great detail till 202. Here is growth. So two characteristics of something that's living. It has to be able to grow and it has to be able to reproduce. So for humans, if we're growing, we grow from one zygote, when the egg and the sperm unite. So egg and sperm unite, fertilized egg, zygote, same thing. And this one cell has to grow up into an embryo, then a fetus, then a child, and then into your adult form. And when you're in your adult form, you're going to do meiosis, which means you have your chromosome numbers. So we have 46 chromosomes, abbreviate there, in all of our cells, except for egg and sperm, where we only have 23. And why is that? Why do we do this process called meiosis? We have the chromosome number so that when the egg and the sperm come together, they have how many? 46. So the top half in blue here is growth. We also grow skin cells, right? If you cut yourself, you create new skin cells. So this doesn't have to be whole organism. It can be at the cellular level as well. And then reproduction is the bottom half. So what I would do is make sure you look up these terms. You understand what mitosis is versus meiosis. Sometimes students struggle with lists like this, from simplest to most complex. So up here we have simple, and here we have complex. This is the whole organism, right? Organismal level. Make sure that you can put these from simple to complex, or you could put them from complex down to simple. What happens if some of them were left out? Could you still organize them even if you were missing a few? What you should understand is that every lower level, so simpler, builds. So if I'm here at a cell, if I'm at the cellular level, a cell is composed of organelles and macromolecules and atoms. So everything below makes up or incorporates the thing above. So what is tissue? Tissue is composed of cells, organelles, molecules, atoms, right? What about an organ? An organ has tissues and cells and organelles. So hopefully we're seeing the point. Everything that's below is incorporated into the next level. Here are the 11 organ systems. We're going to focus on these 4 this semester. We kind of have to do some intro above integumentary. Integumentary is just skin. Or I shouldn't say just skin, it's really important, but it means skin. So we have to come up here and we have to talk about chemistry, and we have to talk about enzymes, and we have to talk about energy, and we have to talk about terms for anatomy and physiology. And then we finally get into these organ systems. And then you'll cover all of these other organ systems when you get to 202. What I want you to see is that the organ systems are all interrelated. So here they're trying to show you you're bringing air into your trachea, to your lungs. The air has oxygen in it, right? And that oxygen has to be transported in your body, right, via your red blood cells. All of this is your cardiovascular. And then where do we drop the oxygen off at? We drop the oxygen off at organs. Specifically, this one is your urinary system. Can we also absorb from our stomach? What if we put food in, right? We put food in, it goes to our stomach, we process it, we break it down mechanically and chemically. We absorb the good stuff in our from our intestines into our cardiovascular. So now we're going to have glucose in our cardiovascular. So can you see how all the organ systems are kind of interconnected? They all play a role with each other. This is why sometimes it's hard to figure out if somebody comes in and they're having an issue. You kind of have to do process of elimination. Well, what's the ultimate organ system that's broken or not working properly? Because it can cause other organ systems to act strange. But it's kind of the byproduct. They're not the real cause. So something that I would do for the organ systems, I would know all the names of the organ systems. I would know what organs are in those organ systems, and I'd have some idea how they're interconnected. You can see here in this image that she's in anatomical position. Hands are facing forward, feet are flat on the ground, head is straight, looking straight ahead. For these body planes, so we have coronal, you might also see some people call it frontal section. Then we have mid-sagittal. Mid-sagittal, sometimes you'll hear people say median, but technically mid-sagittal, and then transverse. So coronal, you're cutting, oh, I lied, that's mid-sagittal. So this one's mid-sagittal. Mid-sagittal mid-sagittal plane creates a left side and a right side. So you're splitting this way. Coronal plane is cutting through the crown. So this is coronal plane. So if you cut coronal plane, you're going to have a back side and a front side. We're going to use the term back, posterior, and for front, anterior. A transverse plane is going to have a top and a bottom. But instead, we're going to call that superior and inferior. For directional terms, for each unit, there's a lab folder. And that's going to have your list of terms, and it's also going to have some questions. Some of the labs don't have questions throughout the semester, but this first one does for these directional terms and prefixes. So what I like to do is go through real quick. Anterior means front. Posterior means back. Superior, top. Inferior, bottom. Medial, middle. Lateral, sides. Proximal means close to trunk. And distal means far away from trunk. So these two, distal and proximal, you're mostly going to use when you're talking about appendages. So your shoulder is proximal compared to your wrist. Your shoulder is closer to the trunk when compared to your wrist. What about your toes? Compared to your hip. Your toes are distal compared to your hip. They're farther away from the trunk. Middle and sides, some easy examples. You could do nose, right? Your nose is medial. What about your heart? Medial. What about your ears? Your ears are on the sides. They are lateral. Most people get superior and inferior, and then most people get anterior and posterior. I always think of posterior, I think of backside for some reason. Some people like to think posterior. This is where the dorsal side, because you'll have a dorsal fin. So we will use the term dorsal and ventral as well down the road. They mean the same thing. And I know it's annoying, it's just how it goes with anatomy. Sometimes we have more than one word that means the same thing. So ventral is the side that you vent from, your mouth. So ventral and anterior are the same, and then posterior and dorsal are the same. So we just covered directional terms. So directional terms of the anterior, posterior, right, proximal, distal. These are regional terms for parts of the body. So we did, in the previous slide, it talked about axial, which is here, and then these are appendicular. And we're going to use those terms when we talk about bones and muscles. So you have to go through and look at some of these terms, and I have them on the list of the ones that I really want you to know. But these regional terms will help you down the road. And I know I keep saying that, but when you get to bones and muscles, knowing these regional terms really will help. Body cavities. So here's that term ventral again. On the ventral side, you have a thoracic cavity and abdominopelvic cavity. So sometimes it's nice to create an outline, right? Ventral cavity. What are the subcavities under ventral? Well, we have thoracic and we have, I'm going to abbreviate, abdominopelvic. What can we break the abdominopelvic cavity? Anytime you see that O, that's kind of a joining of two words. We'll see this again when we look at joints. So under abdominopelvic, we have the abdominal cavity, and then we have the pelvic cavity. So I used to say this was like Russian nesting dolls, but now I realize people don't play with those things anymore and they don't even know what they are. But basically it's a cavity. You have subcavities inside of cavities. So the ventral cavity is the largest, and then you can divide it into two subcavities, and then your subcavities can be divided further. So let's look at your thoracic cavity. This one would be a little more complicated, right? You're going to have pleural cavity, and then you're going to have mediastinum. Mediastinum, middle sternum, that's where that name comes from. And then you're going to have pericardial cavity. Sometimes people will say all of this is mediastinum, and then within mediastinum is pericardial cavity. Here it's listed out separate, that's fine. So you can see that the thoracic cavity has 1, 2, 3 subcavities, and abdominopelvic here has 2 subcavities. So sometimes writing an outline helps kind of organize all this information. Lining these cavities are membranes. So we're going to look at serous membrane layers. These are kind of like watery layers, and you're going to have these anywhere that you're going to have kind of friction or movement. So remember, your heart's beating all the time. So we wrap your heart in 2 layers. We have a parietal pericardium around the heart, and we have a visceral pericardium. Visceral is touching the organ. Parietal touches the wall. So basically, if you have your heart, you have one layer that wraps around the heart, then there's going to be fluid in here, and then you're going to have another layer around the heart. So this is all fluid in here. This was your visceral, and then this is your parietal pericardium. And that would be your visceral pericardium. So why do we have this fluid here? Look at where the heart and the lungs are located within the thoracic cavity. If we didn't have this lining, your heart would be brushing up against your lungs every second that it was beating. Have you ever had your shoe rubbing on your heel? Forms a blister, not so great, right? We probably don't want that on our heart. So we have these 2-layered serous membrane structures that help reduce friction in these organs that move a lot. And we have 3 sets of them. So this was the first set, visceral and parietal pericardium. So what else moves a lot? Lungs. There's a parietal and a visceral pleura. Pleural cavity. So anytime you see that pleural, you should be thinking lungs. And the third set is peritoneum. This is what lines the abdominopelvic cavity. So there's a parietal peritoneum. So this is going to touch the cavity wall, so touches the wall. And the visceral peritoneum is going to touch all of your abdominal organs on the inside, right? Like your liver, your intestines, your stomach. And we don't think about these necessarily moving as much as the lungs and the heart, but your stomach is churning food, your intestines are pushing food through the tube system. So there is a lot of movement there as well. For us, probably the most important quadrants used are this 4 system, right? So the right upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant. The 9 quadrant system is usually used in surgeries where you need to be more specific. But for most nurses and allied health professionals, you'll use the 4 quadrant system much more than you'd use the 9. What I would do is go through and look at the organs that are in each quadrant. Here they show you the anterior facing ones. Also think about the ones that are in the back, right? So the liver, mostly right upper quadrant. The gallbladder here, right upper quadrant. The majority of the stomach, left upper quadrant. Over here you're going to have the appendix, right lower quadrant. But if I removed all of these, go look at where your kidneys are. This usually throws people. Almost everybody wants to tell me kidneys are in the lower, but they're not. They're actually in the upper quadrant. So go look at an image where those have been removed and you can see the kidneys in the back. So now we get to talk about homeostasis. They make it much more complicated, and it is complicated, but they could give you a better definition, right? The ability of an organism to maintain a constant internal environment in response to changing internal or external conditions. So one of the easiest examples we have is our body temperature. So your body temperature, you want to be, let's say 98.6, although we know that people fluctuate, right? I'm about 97.7. That's my normal. So this is your body temperature, but what happens if it's hot outside? If you're outside mowing the lawn, what's going to happen to your body temperature? It's going to go up. And then you come inside and your family has the AC set on 60. What's going to happen, right? So we're constantly up a little bit, down a little bit, up a little bit, down a little bit. We're trying to maintain somewhere near that set point. So when does disease happen, or when does this start affecting you? What happens if we went all the way up? What happens if we went up to 105? Your body temperature was 105. No good, right? So this is when enzymes start breaking down, enzymes that are vital to produce energy for us. So enzymes start breaking down, right? You start getting delirious, and they want to cool you down as quickly as possible because this is too high. Our normal mechanisms to maintain homeostasis are not working. This slide shows you those mechanisms. So what's the first thing that has to happen? For your body to respond, there has to be some sort of stimulus. So here it's saying your body temperature rises. The stimulus, body temperature rising, is picked up by temperature receptors in our skin. So those receptors then send a message to our control center, which is our brain. Basically saying, hey brain, we're getting hot. What do you want to do about it? Your brain has to send out a response, and it sends out a targeted response to an effector, something that's going to effect change. So you're too hot, the receptors pick up that difference that your body temperature has gone up. We send a message to the brain says, oh no, I got to do something about it. And it sends a message to your sweat glands. and it tells your sweat glands to activate and start releasing sweat. This is going to drop your body temperature. Why? So this is kind of what we need to start doing when we learn anatomy and physiology. It's not just memorizing stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, body temperature goes back down. Why does it do this? So what do sweat glands do? They release sweat. What happens to the sweat? Does the sweat evaporate? Yes. And when sweat on your body evaporates, it also pulls heat from your body. So sweat is cooling you down because when it goes from liquid sweat to a gas sweat in the atmosphere, it pulls heat away from your body. So what happens if you're cold? What are the mechanisms? Stimulus, receptor, control center, effector. Do you see in this example how the effector changed? If your body temperature falls and you're cold, do we need to tell your sweat glands to do anything? Nope. You're cold. What are we going to do? The receptors are going to pick up the temperature difference. It's going to go to your brain. Your brain's going to decide what to do. It's going to send a message out to your skeletal muscles, and it's going to tell your skeletal muscles to shake and contract. And when they do, they generate heat. So why does your body temperature rise? Why does your body temperature go back up? Because your muscles are working and they're releasing heat. Hopefully that made sense. See if you can come up with another example that's not sweating or shivering. So see if you can think of another example that uses this homeostatic mechanism. We've just given examples of negative feedback. So homeostatic system regulated by negative feedback. You can always tell it's negative feedback because your result is going to be the opposite of where you started. So you were hot, right? Stimulus was detected, receptor, control center, effector. You started sweating. And what happened to your body temperature? And went lower, right? You cooled down. So if I'm too hot and I come down in body temperature, that's negative feedback. Same thing with shivering, right? If I was too cold, what did I want to do? I wanted to warm myself back up. So if your end result is the opposite, or it's countering what the first cause was, or the stimulus was, that's negative feedback. So when I think negative feedback, I think opposite reaction to what's actually happening right now. So positive feedback is another way that we can have homeostatic regulation. So positive feedback occurs much less frequently. Some examples: breastfeeding, blood clotting, labor. So let's move to the picture and I'll talk about positive feedback, but I like to think of it as kind of driving in the same direction. So an example of positive feedback: if you're breastfeeding, right, the stimulus is the baby is suckling on the breast. The receptors in the breast tissue send a message to the control center. The control center stimulates breast milk to be ejected. And there's some hormones responsible for this that we'll talk about when we get to the second half of anatomy. But could you imagine if the baby started suckling and all of a sudden there's no milk? That would be negative feedback, right? This is positive feedback. Baby suckles, more milk. Baby suckles, more milk. Baby suckles, more milk. On this last slide, I like to talk about spelling differences. So sometimes people get upset that they have to be able to spell lab terms correctly. You do get a half point deduction for spelling errors unless there's multiple errors, and then the question will be marked incorrect. But you can see that sometimes one or two letters makes a difference, especially we can see here. They sound the same, ilium and ilium. What happens if I go in to have surgery to have part of my small intestine removed, and instead they remove a section of my hip bone? Yes, I know that's exaggerated, but it is important. I know sometimes it seems like we're being picky, asking you to spell these things correctly, and this is a lot of information, and why do we have to do this? Remember, if you're doing allied health, at some point, people's lives are in your hands. And I often like to think about, what would I expect a nurse to understand or comprehend if they were taking care of my parents? Would I want them to be able to spell ilium of the small intestine and ilium of the hip correctly? Yeah, probably, because that says something about their attention to detail, right? Their precision. So this is it for chapter 1. If you have any additional questions, please post them on the discussion board or email me privately. Either way is fine. And I'll see you on the next chapter. Bye.